Today we're attempting to summarise Jordan Peterson's We Who Wrestle with God, Brave or What? I picked this one up because I naturally would pick up the next one of his. I think I've read all of his, assuming this is the fourth. Because Jordan Peterson in distilled form is a wonderful thing. I say distilled-ish. This thing is still 500 pages long. A great starting point to set the tone for this is, have you ever wondered what the meaning of life is, or what the meaning of that meaning of life means, and what our purpose is for being here? I definitely have, and it's a very hard question, one I absolutely have no chance of articulating in any sort of sense, but Jordan Peterson's had a really good go. By God, in the context of this book, he clearly is not referring to a being. At least I don't think he's referring to a being, insofar as it's possible to tell anything of what Jordan Peterson is referring to. So this is a book about how to live your life right, but he's using it and illustrating it through biblical metaphors. This is not a religious book, despite the title. It's not clear from this at all how much of the Bible he believes is actually true, in the sense that if you were there, would you have witnessed these things happening? But I don't think that really matters. And to be fair, even if you see interviews with him, he's almost famously evasive, I guess, of that question. And what does it mean to believe? What does it mean to be true? That sort of thing. I don't think it matters. Certainly, the case he makes is good and strong either way, regardless of what he personally believes. For all the appearance of theology in the title, therefore, this book is actually about psychology and philosophy for how to live your life right, and very, very good. The perhaps inevitable catch, however, is that it's not an easy read. Less hard-going, actually, than Maps of Meaning, but not a book you're going to pick up and read casually. So almost every paragraph you read, you need to sort of stop, sit down and think, okay, have I really taken that? Have I understood what he means here? Because of this complexity, it would be impossible to do an adequate summary of this within 10 minutes. You could literally do a deep dive on every single page and probably not run out of things to talk about in 10 minutes. It's that deep and profound in that sense. So my summary, therefore, is just going to basically be pulling out a few of the bits that resonated with me. That's all I ever try and do with a book. If you can get a few ideas out of it to take with you, then great. It's worth having. I guess the Bible part can potentially get misleading, but it's worth bearing in mind that it's coming from the angle of the Bible being the most clever and complex book ever written, which I think is reasonable. So it is a reasonable book, therefore, I think, for him to be basing this idea on. Whether you believe the Bible is true or not, I don't think that actually matters. Or at least doesn't matter for reading this book. Maybe it matters in other contexts, whatever. God in Jordan Peterson's measurement, therefore, is this sort of ineffable idea of the highest possible value. Something akin to the spirit of the cosmic order, or something a little bit abstract like that. It's difficult to wrestle with, but I mean, you're going to need to read the book. This summary isn't going to get you to be able to do your homework without reading the book. But Jordan Peterson's idea of what God is key to the whole idea, so important to keep in mind as we go through. Interestingly, he makes the case that by definition the divine is the highest possible value thing, and goes on even further to say that it's self-evident what those things are in terms of a hierarchical value. If you take any two things, you intrinsically, human beings understand which of the two is the better way forward. As an example, you could choose your God to be money or success or alcohol in case of addiction, potentially. But his argument is that those are demonstrably false gods, because if you follow through the logic, it doesn't make any sense that those would actually be gods. As you can perhaps see there, that's why it's important to understand when he's saying gods, he's not meaning God in the sky, he's just meaning your highest possible value. Money, for example, was interesting when he singled out, it's not money that is the problem, it is the love of money that is the problem. So I suppose he must say that as a wealthy man, mustn't he? But that is all borne out in the Bible as well, I suppose, to be fair. And it indeed makes some sense. As long as you're not obsessed with money and hold it as your highest value, then nothing intrinsically wrong with money. In terms of intrinsic human values that he says we need to live our lives in line with, in order to have a good and contented life. He links these with the Bible, which makes a lot of sense and goes into some depth. But generally, they're largely simple about being roughly good. And whilst you can argue that's subjective as to what good is, he breaks it down to make clear that actually, realistically, you do know. Or rather, you can apply a framework of thinking in terms of taking responsibility, looking after others, self-sacrifice, that sort of thing, to establish which is the better thing that you should be doing. A great bit is, I love it when people just say, what is the meaning of life? And you get the Douglas Adams, the answer's 42. Great, thanks. Jordan Peterson's view is that the Christian story reflects what's ultimately true as the highest values for human beings, broadly being to take as much responsibility as you can bear and to live a good life focused on others rather than internally and on ourselves. He even goes so far as to say this is the essence of humanity, that idea of voluntary self-sacrifice in the service of something higher. Which is brilliant, isn't it? I mean, it's really difficult to argue that. You could really struggle to make a case in some situation that the alternative option to that makes you a better person. His expertise in psychology comes in very useful in the book, actually, and applies it in a very practical, useful and interesting way. He warns that ideas that pop into our heads, we tend to credit them as being good, we as humans that is, based on how quickly and how clearly they emerge. And then there's this idea that whatever we hold highest in our lives, periodically that will be a source of revelation. So if we're following the wrong thing, we're going to get revelations that will also be wrong. And you think, and that's a very massive idea in a very short sentence, but you think that through on anything and it's good. I like it. It's clever. Perhaps unsurprisingly, he's also not afraid to kick ass on the flip side to that. So, you need to do this. But if you don't, then to not tackle this stuff is by definition immature and self-centered, which by reference to the hierarchy of values, we can establish is not a good thing. One of the key objections, I think, to Jordan Peterson in general, I thought was actually illustrated quite well by Richard Dawkins. I saw them having a debate a while back. And Dawkins described Peterson as being drunk on symbols. I do have some sympathy for that view, if not generally for Richard Dawkins' views. I read one of his books, I didn't particularly like it. I did a video on that, actually. But it's difficult to argue with the case that something like the story of the hare and the tortoise, as humans, we absorb more meaning from that than someone just saying, if you go slow and steady and consistent, it's going to beat over sort of just rapid and unsustainable action. I mean, bottom line, the statement, rapid and unsustainable action is not going to do as well, is nice and short and compact and has all that information in it, but it just doesn't absorb very well. So I think Jordan Peterson's argument that metaphor and symbology, they do have value. As part of the book, I quite liked, he calls out Friedrich Nietzsche, who's talking about God is dead and we have killed him, the famous line of his. But he goes on to say that Friedrich Nietzsche mentions that humanity has to come up with our own values to replace it with, and Jordan Peterson feels that's wrong, albeit then kind of does the same thing anyway, saying that we intrinsically know what the value, what's right, what's wrong, and all the rest of it. So it's not immediately obvious that he's not doing exactly the same thing that he's criticising Nietzsche for. Albeit I suppose Nietzsche is just, he could just write down some rules, as have been done in some societies, as opposed to paying attention to whatever that thing is inside us that mysteriously seems to know what is right and what is wrong. I'm going to finish this with doing the same as I did in the previous video, where I picked out my favourite 3 quotes, because I think that's a great thing to be able to take from a good book. And I put a lot of hours into reading this thing, so that's what I want to capture. Admittedly, it's not 3 in this case, it's 8, but, it's the same idea. The first one is he talks about rationalist, materialist atheism is the camouflage of the irresponsible. Quite like that. It's sort of cat, pigeons, wow. That's an example, isn't it? I mean, that one line, you could spend hours talking about that and debating it, but it's an interesting idea. The next one is he says, if you pray towards improper ends, then your prayer will be answered by demons. Bearing in mind these are metaphorical demons, not actual demons, but the idea that if you're aiming at the wrong thing, then your feedback from that is going to be based on the wrong thing. Perhaps inevitably, the question of belief comes up, with Jordan Peterson asking and answering his own question in his quote. So question being, what does belief mean? And his answer being that it's measured by action. We act as if the Bible is true when we are behaving properly. And I guess it's difficult to argue with that. Yes, the Bible is famous for lots of things in there that don't come across very well, and you get the obtuse sort of views. Whereas actually, if you engage with it and read it properly and think about it, it's not quite so problematic, at least to the extent I've read it. I haven't read the whole thing yet. I'm still working through it. But the big picture that comes through in the Bible in terms of what we're being taught to do, difficult to argue with. You think kind of he has a point. This one I'm definitely going to have to read because it's quite long. But it's there's little difference between self-directed focus and suffering on the basis that self-consciousness correlates highly with anxiety, depression, and impression management. It's tied also with the deception of self and others. That's one of those lines that sort of, if you think about it, sounds kind of obvious, but you probably hadn't thought it. Well, I hadn't thought about it in those terms. And it's a good point. He even links the story of Adam and Eve in the Bible, because that's the point of the book, to suddenly experiencing self-consciousness by virtue of eating the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which seemed like a reasonable proxy for consciousness. And that then leading them to the temptation to form the allegiance with the snake in order to get away from the discomfort that came about as a result of that self-consciousness. And it's like, okay, that's a pretty big idea. But it seems reasonable. Perhaps not all anxiety, depression and impression management comes from impression management, I guess that's trying to control an external view of you. But perhaps everyone knows people who have perhaps too much focus on what others think about them and put a lot of effort into that. And you can see them doing it, and it doesn't seem likely that that's very good for them. It's just Jordan Peterson puts that much more concisely than I can. That one ties up quite nicely with the next quote, which is a similar idea, being that the secret to confidence on stage is to focus on projecting useful truth rather than think about how you are coming across. And obviously that's, most of us aren't going to be on a stage, but in the Shakespearean idea, is it Shakespeare? All life is a stage. That's a really interesting idea, isn't it? The idea that, again, having a focus on you is such a terrible idea for any sort of interaction with other people. Quite a harsh quote for the next one, being the enabling of dependency is not admirable mercy. This reflects one of my sort of bugbears, I guess, about mollycoddled children. I know several people who've had terrible upbringings, neglect or even abuse and all the rest of it. But I also know some people who've been brought up properly mollycoddled by their parents. And you would have to say that whilst, you wouldn't choose either option for anybody, the ones who've had the very difficult life, in my experience, they generally seem to be the more competent lot compared to the mollycoddlers who tend quite often to have grown up pretty selfish and useless. So we see parents over sheltering children. That gets my hackles up a little bit, which I shouldn't, obviously. But it looks like someone being a good parent, but actually it's just really not. On a very simple basis, yeah, sure, maybe it is, but it does them no favours, does it? So I quite like that. There's a Jordan Peterson approach to that one. The next one is, it is the ability to give word to the vagaries of now and lay out a compelling path into the future that constitutes leadership. Gosh, these sentences are hard to say. I think that's just an issue that's slightly close to my heart at the minute because I'm involved in some stuff that there's some less than perfect leadership, I suppose, and so leadership is something on the agenda. But that's an interesting definition for what leadership is. It's how many things in life where someone says, okay, define this, could you do it? And how would I define leadership? Certainly not that concisely. So useful one. Number 7, I think we're on to number 7. It's easier in the short term to lower others than to strive genuinely upwards. Quite like that as well. It's easier thing to find yourself doing, isn't it? And I like to think I catch a lot of my bad behaviours before I actually let them out into the world. but I definitely feel them, and it's I do have to catch it before it becomes external. And for the most part, I'd say I'm mostly successful. I think it's reasonable to say. My friends and family will be watching this, so you'll tell me. But I definitely understand the urge to, you're not feeling great about something, so you drag someone else down, then you don't have to elevate. And it's because it's quite often a thankless thing to elevate, isn't it? People don't often know if you're doing it, if you're doing the better thing or being the bigger man, as it says. So it's no glory in it, generally. But yeah, I really like that idea. And finally, last but not least, we negotiate with the future through sacrifice. On my other YouTube channel, Reading the Bible, there's a lot of sacrifice, and I've made lots of comments about it being really weird sacrifice. I don't understand it in the terms of goats and lambs and donkeys and whatever. But Jordan Peterson makes a good point that, you know, there is modern sacrifice, and we just don't necessarily see it. So you can do the right thing now, and future you can benefit from it, and that is a sacrifice. And I quite like that. But yeah, so that is a massive book with huge ideas in it, and that's the best I've got in terms of condensing and a summary on that. But yeah, read it. Just don't read it half-heartedly. You need to sit down, it needs to be quiet, and it's going to take a while because it's a whopper. Brilliant though, thoroughly enjoyed it. Probably could have been shorter, I suppose, but you know, you get your money's worth, don't you? But anyway, next I'm definitely going to read something a bit thinner and more light-hearted, I think.